My name is Silas. I am 31 years old, and I did something that no man in chains was ever supposed to do. I made the most powerful woman in Cypress Hill fall apart from the inside. Not with violence, not with rebellion, with truth. With the kind of raw, undeniable truth that cuts deeper than any whip ever could. I was born into bondage on a Georgia plantation where the soil was red as old blood and the air tasted like cotton dust and sweat. They told me my body belonged to the Sterling family. They branded it, worked it, watched it. But there was one thing they could never touch, the part of me that observed everything, calculated everything, and waited. This is not a story about suffering. This is a story about power, and about how I took mine back, one unbearable moment at a time. And before I go any further, I need to ask you something. Because a story like this one, you don't just watch it. You feel it in your chest. If you already feel something stirring inside you right now, if something in my words touched a place you weren't expecting, hit that like button. Subscribe. Leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from, whether that's Georgia, London, Texas, or somewhere across the ocean I've never seen. Every comment, every subscription helps my family keep the lights on and keeps these stories alive. This is how we put food on the table. This is how the truth keeps getting told. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. But before I tell you what I did, before I tell you about the fire, the whip, and the long road north through the swamp, I need you to understand something. What happened between Isadora Sterling and me was not simple. It was not clean. It will make you uncomfortable, and it should, because real stories never sit easy. They scratch at you. They follow you to bed at night and pull at your sleeve in the morning. I carried this story inside me for decades, locked away like something too dangerous to say out loud. And now I am ready. Now I will say every word. But first, if this already has your heart beating a little faster, if you feel something stirring in your chest right now, I want you to leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. Subscribe if you want to hear the rest. This story helped put food on my family's table, and your support means everything. Cypress Hill smelled like iron and jasmine, and that combination never made sense to me until I understood that beautiful things and brutal things can live in the same place without shame. The main house stood at the end of a long dirt road lined with live oak trees dripping with Spanish moss, gray and ghostly in the morning light. From the fields, those white columns looked like teeth. The Georgia sun came down flat and merciless from June through September, baking the red clay until it cracked like old skin. At night, the swamp behind the south field breathed. Frogs, crickets, something moving in the dark water that you never wanted to look at directly. That was Cypress Hill, beautiful on the surface, rotting underneath. I knew every inch of that land the way a prisoner knows every crack in his cell wall. Not because I loved it, but because survival demanded it. My days began before the sun did. I was up before the roosters, hauling water from the well to the horse stalls, then moving to the fields before the overseer, Mr. Hatch, had finished his first cup of rye whiskey. I was what they called a prime hand, strong enough to pick 300 pounds of cotton on a hard day, smart enough to keep my mouth shut when it mattered. I fixed fences. I broke horses. I translated the land's moods for the other men when storms were coming in off the Gulf. I was useful, and usefulness was the closest thing to safety a man like me could get. But I was never invisible. I watched everything. I memorized the patterns. Who drank too much on Friday nights? Who owed debts to whom? Which doors were left unlocked after midnight? Information was my real currency, and I had been saving it for years. The wound I carried was not made by a whip. It was made by a name, or rather by the absence of one. My mother had called me Silas before they took her away when I was 7 years old. Sold south, to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where men did not last long. I never saw her again. I spent years trying to hold on to the sound of her voice, The weight of her hand on my forehead when I had fever, the way she hummed low and slow when she thought no one was listening. But memory is fragile when you have nothing to anchor it to. By the time I was grown, I could no longer hear her voice clearly in my mind. And that emptiness, that specific, hollow silence where a mother should be, was the thing that made me dangerous. Because a man with nothing left to lose is not a slave. He is a storm waiting to find a direction. It happened on a Tuesday in late October, when the air had finally broken from the summer heat and carried the first thin edge of autumn. I was mending the fence along the ridge trail when I heard the horse before I saw it, a high, panicked whinny that cut through the tree line like a blade. Then I saw her, Isadora Sterling, riding that gray mare she called Duchess, coming too fast around the bend where the trail narrowed above the ravine. The mare hit a loose stone and reared, both front legs off the ground, all that weight shifting backward toward the edge. Time did something strange in that moment. It did not slow down the way people say it does. It sharpened. Every detail became a needle, the red clay crumbling at the ridge edge, the white of Isadora's knuckles on the reins, the exact angle of the drop below. My body moved before my mind gave any order. I dropped the fence post and ran. I caught her at the waist as Duchess twisted away from the edge. We hit the ground together hard, my back taking the impact, her body landing full against my chest. For 3 seconds, neither of us moved. I could feel her heartbeat against my ribs, fast and desperate, like a trapped bird throwing itself against the bars of a cage. I could feel the heat rising off her skin through that green velvet riding habit. And I could feel the exact moment when her terror shifted into something else, something she had no name for and no permission to feel. I held on one breath longer than I needed to, not out of cruelty, out of honesty, because in that moment, the truth was simple and enormous and undeniable. We were two human beings pressed together in the dirt, and every law that said otherwise was a lie. I saw it register in her eyes, and I knew that what I had just done could get me killed. She said nothing when she stood. She straightened her jacket with both hands, slow and deliberate, like a woman rebuilding a wall brick by brick in real time. She did not look at me. She caught Duchess by the bridle, mounted without assistance, and rode back toward the house without a single word. But her hands were still trembling on the reins. I watched her go and felt the weight of what had just shifted between us settle into my bones like cold water. By sundown, Mr. Hatch came to find me at the barn. He did not explain why. He did not need to. 2 other men held my arms while a third tied my wrists to the post. I had been reported for insubordination. 50 lashes, ordered by Miss Isadora Sterling herself. I stood at that post and I thought, she is trying to burn out what she felt. She is trying to use my pain to erase her own. And I decided right then that I would not let her. The morning after the whipping, I went back to work. That was the first act of resistance. Not running, not fighting, but returning to those fields with my back wrapped in cloth soaked in turpentine and my spine straight as a pine tree. Mr. Hatch watched me from his horse with something between confusion and fury, because a broken man was manageable, but an unbroken one was a problem he did not have the vocabulary to solve. Word spread through the quarters fast. Silas took 50 and came back standing. The other men looked at me differently after that, but the real consequence came from the house. I began to notice things. A curtain moving when I passed below the upper window. A water jug left near my workstation that had not been there the day before. Small things. Quiet things. The kind of things a woman does when she cannot stop thinking about a man and cannot admit it even to herself. Isadora Sterling was watching me, and she was losing the battle she had started. At night, alone in the quarters, I lay on my side to keep the wounds off the rough wood, and I thought about what I was doing. I was not a fool. I understood the machinery of that world with terrible clarity. One accusation, One wrong look interpreted by the wrong person, and I would be sold south, or hanged from one of those beautiful oak trees before sunrise. I thought about my mother. I wondered if she had ever looked at danger the way I was looking at it now. Not as something to avoid, but as the only door left in a room with no windows. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. Fear lived in me like a second heartbeat, always present, always drumming just beneath the surface. But I had learned something young. Fear and courage are not opposites. They are the same river flowing in different directions. I chose my direction, and I held it. 3 weeks after the whipping, Isadora Sterling made her second mistake. She summoned me to the house to repair a broken shutter on the second floor, a job that any carpenter among us could have done. I climbed the ladder in full view of the overseer, the house servants, and 2 neighboring plantation wives who had come for afternoon tea. When I reached the window, she was standing just inside the frame, close enough that I could see the small pulse beating at the base of her throat. She handed me the tools herself, which no mistress ever did. Her fingers brushed mine for half a second. It was nothing. It was everything. One of the neighboring women below said something sharp and laughed. Isadora's jaw tightened. I fixed the shutter in silence and climbed back down without raising my eyes. But the damage was done. People had begun to notice the shape of something they could not yet name. And in the antebellum South, suspicion moved faster than truth and hit harder than a whip. Her father noticed first. Colonel Augustine Sterling was 60 years old, built like a man who had never once questioned his right to own another human being, with eyes the color of dirty river water. He called me to his study on a Thursday evening, which was unusual enough to make my stomach drop the moment Hatch delivered the summons. The colonel sat behind his mahogany desk with a glass of bourbon and a long silence that he used like a weapon. He told me I was being transferred to the Beaumont estate, assigned to work under Baron Beaumont, Isadora's intended. It was framed as a reward. It was a warning. He watched my face the entire time he spoke, looking for the flinch, the tell, the crack that would confirm what he suspected. I gave him nothing. I thanked him with the exact amount of deference required and walked out of that study with my pulse hammering in my ears. They were moving me, and if I left Cypress Hill, I would disappear into someone else's machinery forever. That night was the longest of my life up to that point. I sat outside the quarters in the dark, listening to the swamp breathe, and I felt the walls closing in from every direction. If I stayed, the colonel's suspicion would eventually find its proof, and I would hang. If I was transferred to Beaumont, I would lose what little leverage I had built and vanish into a stranger's fields. If I ran before either could happen, the patrols would find me within 3 days. I had seen it happen to better men than me. There was no clean path. There was no safe choice. And somewhere above me in that white house, behind curtained windows, Isadora Sterling was making her own calculations, caught between the life her father had built for her and something wild and terrifying that she had felt in the dirt on a Tuesday afternoon in October. We were both trapped, and I began to understand that our only way out might be the same door, if either of us was brave enough to open it. She came to find me 2 nights before my scheduled transfer. I heard the soft crunch of footsteps on dry grass around midnight, and I was already sitting up when she appeared at the edge of the tree line, wrapped in a dark wool cloak, holding a small oil lamp with the flame turned so low it was barely a breath of light. She should not have been there. Every law, written and unwritten, said she should not have been there. But she sat down on the ground across from me, not beside me, across from me, like someone preparing for a negotiation. And she opened her cloak and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, written in her hand, addressed to a Quaker family in Cincinnati named Aldrich. She had been corresponding with them for 8 months, long before the ravine, long before the whipping. Isadora Sterling had already been planning an escape from her own life, And she had been doing it completely alone, in silence, right under her father's roof. I stared at that letter and felt the entire shape of everything I thought I understood shift beneath me like loose ground. Everything rearranged itself in my mind in the span of a single breath. The water jug left near my workstation. It was not only longing, it was reconnaissance. She'd been watching me the way I had been watching everyone else. Measuring, calculating, deciding if I could be trusted. The transfer order to Beaumont was not just her father's warning to me. It was a death sentence for her plan, because I was the one person on Cypress Hill who moved between the fields, the stables, the ridge trails, and the swamp edge without raising suspicion. She needed me. Not the way a mistress needs a servant, the way a soldier needs someone who knows the terrain. She looked at me across that small flame and said 7 words that reorganized my entire existence. I cannot do this without you, Silas. And I understood then that the power I thought I had been slowly, carefully building was real. It had been real all along. She had seen it before I had fully claimed it for myself. I sat with those 7 words for a long time before I answered her, because the choice in front of me was not simple, and I refused to pretend it was. If I helped her, I was betting every remaining day of my life on a woman who had ordered 50 lashes across my back without blinking. A woman raised from birth to see me as property. A woman whose guilt and desire and desperation could shift direction at any moment and burn me alive with a single word to her father. And if I refused, if I sent her back to that house and took my transfer to Beaumont in silence, I would survive another day inside a system designed to grind me to nothing, slowly, without ever giving me the dignity of a clean ending. Neither option was good. Neither option was safe. But one of them had a horizon in it. One of them had the faint, dangerous shape of something that had not existed for me since I was 7 years old, and my mother was taken away. The shape of a future. I looked at Isadora Sterling across that dying flame, and I made the only choice a man with a living soul could make. I told her yes, but I told her my terms first. And that moment of speaking my terms to a Sterling, on Sterling land, under a Georgia sky, was the moment I became fully free inside, long before my body crossed any border. I told her we would move on my timeline, not hers. I told her she would follow my instructions without question from the moment we left until the moment we reached Cincinnati. I told her that if she broke, if she panicked, if she tried to use her name or her family's reputation to negotiate with anyone we encountered on the road, I would leave her where she stood without looking back. She did not flinch. She did not argue. She folded that letter, placed it back inside her cloak, and nodded once, slow and deliberate, the way a person nods when they are agreeing to something that will change them permanently. In that moment, something ancient and cruel between us cracked down the middle. We were not equals yet, but we were no longer what we had been, and that was enough to begin. The fire started on a Friday night, and I will carry the smell of burning pine and white paint to my grave. I do not know if it was accident or providence. I have stopped trying to decide. What I know is this. When the flames caught the east wing of Cypress Hill and the alarm bell began ringing across the property, every plan Isadora and I had built over 6 careful days collapsed into pure instinct. I saw Baron Beaumont from across the yard, that soft, powdered coward, mount his horse and ride north without looking back at the house, without looking back at her. Not once. The fire was climbing the columns when I went in through the kitchen door, moving low under the smoke, calling her name in a voice I had never used before. Not the voice I used in the fields, not the voice I used with Hatch. My real voice, full and unguarded, the one my mother used to answer to. I found Isadora on the 2nd floor landing, frozen, watching her father's portrait burn. I took her hand, and I pulled her out of that house and out of that life in one motion, and neither of us looked back at the columns as they fell. We moved through the swamp for 11 nights, following the North Star the way my mother had once whispered about in the dark, a story I had held on to for 24 years like a compass I could not yet use. Isadora did not complain. She tore the hem of her dress on the third night to keep it from dragging in the water, and she kept moving. She blistered. She went hungry. She learned to be silent for hours at a time, which I suspect was the hardest thing a Sterling had ever done. We crossed into Tennessee on the 9th night, hidden in the back of a Quaker farmer's grain wagon under burlap sacks that smelled like wet earth and safety. The Aldrich family in Cincinnati was waiting. A warm kitchen, bread on the table, a woman named Ruth who held Isadora's ruined hands and wept without explanation. And me, I stood in that doorway and breathed air that did not belong to anyone who owned me. For the first time in 31 years, the ground beneath my feet was simply the ground. It belonged to gravity and to God, and I was standing on it as a free man. I am an old man now, and I still wake before sunrise, not because anyone forces me to, but because the habit of watching the light return is something I never want to lose. Isadora is beside me, gray-haired and quieter than the woman who once rode with her back straight as iron through someone else's idea of a perfect world. We do not speak much about Cypress Hill anymore, but some mornings, when the sky turns that particular shade of deep blue just before dawn, she reaches across and takes my hand without a word, and I understand everything that gesture contains. The weight of what we survived, the cost of what we chose, the strange and painful grace of having been broken open by life and choosing to remain open anyway. I learned that freedom is not a destination you arrive at. It is a decision you make every single morning, in the quiet, before the world wakes up and starts telling you again who you are supposed to be. They tried to own my body. They never touched what was inside it. And that is the only victory that ever truly mattered.